Good afternoon, and welcome to the session, Why It's Time to Embrace Storytelling as the New Event Medium. My name is Myra Cruz. I'm an Educational Program Manager at CASE, and I'll be serving as the moderator today. Before I turn things over to our speaker, I wanted to remind you to add any questions that you may have throughout the session to the Q&A box that is located at the bottom of your screen. Questions added to the chat may get lost in the conversation. You will also be able to upvote other attendees' questions in the Q&A and share your own written responses to those questions if you have an idea or solution you'd like to offer. Thank you for joining us this session. I will now like to turn things over to Brian Elizardi, who is the Director of Alumni Engagement at the University of Denver.
Thank you, Mara, and welcome everyone. It's a delight to be here with you today. So to get our session started today, I want you to head to the website menti.com. We put in the chat box a code that I want you to go enter. And so there's a question I want you to answer as we get started. I'm going to quickly switch my screen over to that. So bear with me here a second so that you can see the results as they come in. So I know many of you are already on here, which is great. So question is, how does a great story make you feel? So these are real-time results that are coming in. I want you just to kind of take a look at some of the different responses that folks are coming in. So this is a dynamic word cloud that is automatically sorting your different responses and kind of pulling out the top responses here, as you know, in the larger format. So take a moment to think about maybe a great podcast, a great book that you read recently. Maybe it was a movie or a favorite series that you've been sort of binging on in these times, and just kind of reflect on how does that story really make you feel? You know, what stands out for you? What's the emotion? What keeps you coming back to that story? And you guys can see here with me kind of in real time what those responses are. A lot of folks are saying inspired, motivated, happy, empowered, engaged. That's obviously a big topic for us this week. Connected, excited. These are great. So we're going to talk later on today about tools and tips. And so this is one I want to kind of put in your toolbox. This is a great website that you can use for your online events and your webinars. Just a different way to kind of interject some crowd engagement and to have folks kind of participate. So I'm going to flip over now. Thank you so much for taking time to put those questions in. I'm going to go back to my presentation here. So bear with me here a second. All right. So here we go. So thank you so much for taking time to complete that. And our topic today really is focused on this idea of event storytelling, you know, and the role that events can play in really elevating event experiences. So storytelling, as many of you know, is a very popular topic, and it's become increasingly essential for event success. So we're going to talk a bit about how you start to apply that to your thought process as an event planner. And then also, too, I want to pay some attention to how do you do that in the era of COVID? You know, so a lot of the tips and strategies and principles that I'm going to run through today, you'll find that they're pretty universal. Some will be specifically for in-person events, but I don't want you to think that that's just where you can apply these. These are really intended to be much more some guiding principles, some guiding ideas that you can take and really sort of agnostic of format, if you will. So, you know, another key part of storytelling is so many of us are really being challenged to think creatively and innovatively. And that puts a lot of pressure on us. And I've seen over the course of the day, the last couple of days, folks really sort of saying, okay, I'm being challenged. What do I do? You know, what does that mean? And I feel like this is people asking me to work more. So I want to kind of walk through today just this format and ways that you can begin to use it to address some of that pressure that you might be feeling. All right, so here's just sort of a brief rundown of what we'll cover today, kind of three main areas. You know, first of all is why should you use stories in your events? You know, what are the guiding principles that you should sort of adhere to when you begin to think about storytelling events? And then lastly, I want you to walk away with some concrete tips and tools that you can take with you to really create event stories that resonate. All right, so why even have this conversation? what is it about storytelling? What is it about storytelling events that makes it sort of land here in this conference? And so 4 kind of key components of event storytelling that I want to kind of walk you through first. And the first one really is that stories are universal. We're used to them. We grew up with them. We understand them at a very deep and visceral level, and they help to explain our daily lives. Second, stories are everywhere. They're ubiquitous. They're in every human language. They're in myths, they're in lore, they're in movies, they're in books, they're in audiobooks, they're in Facebook, they're in Instagram. They become so much of a fabric of our daily lives that we really want to harness sort of this energy, and also to just the fact that everyone is grappling now with stories, and they're really pulling people in. The next is that stories are just really efficient. They're great ways to package complex ideas, feelings, emotions, and to put them into simple and relatable and engaging formats. And the last thing, and this is kind of the most important part, I think, for some of the work that we do in advancement, is that stories tell the world what we value. They help to communicate and convey who we are, what we stand for. And in the era of COVID, in the era of social unrest, I think that's so important for us to really sort of double click on. For me, ultimately, I think this is sort of a perfect quote from Don Norman. He's an American researcher and an author and professor from UC San Diego. And he's best known for his books on design. And I thought he really put it perfectly when he said that stories are these important cognitive events. They encapsulate into one compact package all the information, the knowledge, the context, and the emotion. So let's get started. And so I want to walk you through now just a couple of guiding principles that are really just sort of ubiquitous for storytelling, and kind of give you an idea of like, what does storytelling look like, and what are the things that we can use to help inform the process of incorporating these into our events. And the first key principle that we have to adhere to when it comes to storytelling is that stories inherently take a stance. They are positional. To really sort of detail this, I want to walk you through a video here. This is the video is going to play now for a couple of minutes, and I apologize in advance if it's choppy for you, because I know sometimes the videos don't quite always load the way that we like them to on Zoom. But first, I want to just sort of have you watch this video for the next couple of minutes, and then we'll discuss afterwards.
If people say your dreams are crazy, if they laugh at what you think you can do, good. Stay that way. Because what non-believers fail to understand is that calling a dream crazy is not an insult. It's a compliment. Don't try to be the fastest runner in your school or the fastest in the world. Be the fastest ever. Don't picture yourself wearing OBJ's jersey. Picture OBJ wearing yours. Don't settle for homecoming queen or linebacker. Do both. Lose 120 pounds and become an Ironman after beating a brain tumor. Don't believe you have to be like anybody to be somebody. If you're born a refugee, don't let it stop you from playing soccer for the national team at age 16. Don't become the best basketball player on the planet. Be bigger than basketball. Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. When they talk about the greatest team in the history of the sport, make sure it's your team. If you have only one hand, don't just watch football, play it at the highest level. And if you're a girl from Compton, don't just become a tennis player. Become the greatest athlete ever. Yeah, that's more like it. So don't ask if your dreams are crazy. Ask if they're crazy enough.
All right, so I've been watching that video, I think probably about 25 times in the last 48 hours, and I've got chills, And what I love so much about what that video conveys is that it kind of forces you to make a choice on where you stand. You know, most of us know Colin Kaepernick. If you didn't know him before, you definitely know him now. You know, even for me, I watched Colin Kaepernick tear up my own team. You know, and I watched this video, and I can't help but be pulled in. You know, many of you kind of remember this video. I know you kind of you mentioned that, Chad, and it really had this really intense effect. You know, and I love this quote last year from Fast Company that sort of reflected on the ad about a year later. And I think it kind of neatly summarizes up this point I'm trying to make, which is that, you know, the commercial lit up the cultural discourse. People loved it, people hated it, people bought Nikes, people burned Nikes. Ultimately, people talked about it at home, they talked about it at work, and they talked about it in the news. And it really forces you to choose where you decide. I thought Nike founder Phil Knight kind of put it perfectly in terms of what this ultimately means from kind of a strategic standpoint. And it's that you can't be afraid of offending people. You can't try to go down the middle of the road. You have to take a stand on something. And that's really kind of at the heart of what we're trying to convey here with stories, is that, you know, nobody wants to get behind something ambiguous individual. They want someone that really stands for principle. You know, think about Harry Potter, think about some of the best stories that are out there, you know, and they really stand on those principles, and that really pulls us in. So take a stance in your story. You know, a good story really forces you to make a choice about who you are, what you believe in. You know, it also helps to convey to the audience who you are and what you believe. And it tells the world what you're willing to stand up for. So that's principle one, take a stance. Next, I want to talk about this idea of how do you showcase the inclusivity. And to do that, I want to show you another ad here. And this is a great campaign that's been going on for about 10 years now. This is the Dove Real Beauty campaign. And this is one of their recent advertisements. So what I love so much about what this Dove campaign did is it showed real people laughing and just being comfortable in their own skin. You know, these are women that have their own stories to tell, and Dove really helped them give confidence to their stories. And so how that applies to our work really is making sure that we're really being inclusive of the excellence that exists in our community. You know, I think this has always been a universal precept, but in this day and age, especially in the response to the civil unrest, I think this is really sort of a key principle that I want to call out. You know, a lot of you have been talking about this idea, like how do we avoid coming across as tone deaf? And you have to represent the multiple voices that are within your community. You know, if you want to tell that effective story, and if you want that ultimately to have full traction. All right, so take a stance, showcase inclusivity. Next up is demonstrate authenticity. You know, I think oftentimes when it comes to thinking about storytelling, we feel like we have to project our best selves. And so what I want to do is give you permission to show yourself in progress. And to do that, I want to share another video with you. This is a great ad campaign by a local company here in Denver, Overtone. They're a hair care company, and they had this great campaign they did around kind of my hair, my story. So what does my hair mean for my identity?
I am Lulu Fall. I'm a singer, actor, songwriter, and I reside in New York City. My hair is natural, and I definitely have had friends and colleagues and castmates tell me that they are nervous for me because they think that my hair severely limits the kinds of roles that I can go out for, especially in the business that I'm in. It's easy to get discouraged. I choose not to let that bog me down anymore. I believe that things are changing in this industry, especially for African American women. You're seeing more African American women who are rocking natural hair. I have not considered wearing anything other than my natural hair because this is who I am and I love it. But she makes me grow. She wears.
So another great example of authenticity, is people who have a story to tell about their hair, about the color, and what it really means about their identity. It's a powerful campaign that Overtone went on to have great success with across multiple channels. And so for you, when you think about your events and how you begin to incorporate this into an event format, people want to see that authenticity in action. They don't need to see it perfect, and it's so important that you reflect that sense of inclusion and those multiple voices and in terms of how you share that story and how you demonstrate that sense of authenticity. So those are the first three. Last up, I want to walk you through this idea of the reference bias. And so there's great research to back this one up, and I know some of you are familiar with this because I shared this before at Case, but Todd Rogers is a professor of public policy at Harvard Kennedy School, and he wanted to better understand, what motivated people, what inspired them, what got them off the couch, what got them, to aspire, and not only to aspire, but also to take the steps to become their best selves and to achieve their goals. And so he had this groundbreaking study that looked at how do you motivate people to run, So he looked at a group of non-runners, and he split them up into two groups. And so the first group was motivated, and they were showing images of the best of the best. So your elite Olympians, your Ironmen, your Iron Women, your marathoners, the best of the best. Folks that we're all very familiar with because we see them on the cover page of magazines, we see them on the sports channels, and so that was the target group one. The second target group was actually showing a very different set of images, and that was more of your weekend warriors, your soccer moms, your amateur athletes, your 5K runners, folks that really just are kind of maybe one or two steps in front of the other group. And what he found actually is it was that group that actually had the biggest effect on getting the individuals off the couch and beginning to not only develop a running habit, but to stick with it longer over time. And it has to do with this idea of the reference point. And so oftentimes when we think about our own stories, I think within higher ed and with advancement, if you look at the way we tell the story of our achievement and our impact on society, oftentimes we do the latter. We tell the marathon. We do the folks that are at the pinnacle of their career. They've got great hair. Maybe they put their name on the side of one of our buildings, or maybe they're getting the Alumni Achievement Award. And my argument and my point is that you can't not tell those stories. That's very much a part of who we are. And broadcasting that sense of achievement is at the core of what we do in advancement. But that can't be the only story that you tell, is my point. So think about, when it comes to identifying kind of your event and if you've got a target audience, don't go too far. In fact, in many cases, that if the distance is too great, it can be demotivating for a lot of folks. So think about kind of right-sizing that reference point. Extraordinary stories are great, but if I can't see myself in the success of the hero, it's just too much. It becomes intimidating, it becomes inspiring. Help your audience see themselves in that struggle, the pain, the frustration, the anguish of what it meant to establish that habit or to share that idea, to get it out into the world, and then find that right sense of upward comparison when you're thinking about your story. All right, so those are our 4 guiding principles. I want to transition now into kind of the meat here, and really kind of equip you with some specific tactical skills and some tools that you can take away. So 4 key tips for creating events that resonate. The first is this idea of creating an event persona. Now, this is an idea that I'm borrowing from marketing. And the basic premise here is that you want to go deep with your event, okay? And so you want to think through, if my event were a person, who would they be? This is a great example of some market research that's done to begin to better understand a target individual, if you will. And so this is Amy Jones. These are her preferences. These are her goals. This is kind of her persona. Amy is an avid listener of NPR. She shops at Whole Foods. She loves to support nonprofits. So we start to paint a picture of who Amy is. I want you to do the same thing with your events. So if your event were a person, who would they be? What would they eat? What would they do on the weekend? Where do they shop? What kind of music do they listen to? Are they on Android? Are they on iPhone? Really just start to go deep with, giving your event a personality. and helping it to sort of live and breathe in the world and begin to sort of attach some of these characteristics to it so that it, you start to create a persona around it. So step one is design your event persona. Step two is begin thinking about the hero's journey. Now, this is a concept that is very familiar to all of us. And whether or not you've read Joseph Campbell or you're just an avid movie fan like I am, you're going to recognize the hero's journey. So the hero goes on an adventure, and in a decisive crisis, they win a victory, and then they come home changed and forever transformed. So it's a trope that we're all very familiar with. It's one that we experience on a regular basis. Odysseus is the classic example, that's out there in literature. And so what I want you to do is to kind of leverage some of this framework to start thinking about your own hero's journey, okay? And so when you are identifying speakers or participants in your event, folks that are really gonna sort of bring the event to life, think about the hero's journey, Position your speaker, position your alum, your donor, the individual that you're profiling as really the hero of the story. And just know that flawed heroes are so much more relatable. It's so much more easier for me to connect with someone that is imperfect. And so that gets back to that idea of authenticity and really allowing that sense of authenticity to come through, and then really just giving them, a reason to connect, with on an emotional level. All right, so next up is once you've got your persona, you've got an idea of kind of who your event is trying to go after, what the persona of the event is, you've got a sense of who the participants and the characters are in your story. I want you to get to work to start to reverse engineer the story. Now, what do I mean by reverse engineer? Pull up, any news publication today and read, sort of an article or something, a newsworthy story that's going to be on the front page, and chances are it will conform to this basic structure. Anyone that's studied journalism is going to be very familiar with this sort of pyramid of storytelling, So, two people were injured on the corner of Evans and University. They were two people that were traveling in from Utah. They were in town to visit family. It is the fourth accident that's happened on this corner. So you start to get a feel for how they start with the lead, and then over time through the story, they start to add more context and clarity. When it comes to the event, I want you to flip that on its head. So don't go directly to the lead. And this informs not only the event itself, but how you tell the whole story through the marketing, the email, the promotion, the closing, the follow-up. But think about, what does the ultimate sort of conclusion mean for us as a society? What does it mean for us as an organization? If you want a powerful example of this, just pull up any episode of The Daily, and you will see how journalists take the first pyramid, which is the story that they produced and that they published in the magazine or the newspaper, and then how they have reimagined that story for the medium of podcast. So you'll never hear them talk about the lead right off the top, but they'll start to paint the picture about what does the surrounding context look like, who are the key players, what was a key element to that, and then over time, the 20 minutes of the podcast, you'll eventually get to what is going to be sort of the hypothesis for the lead of the story. This is a great thing that we've used before in the past. This is Eric and Joseph. So Eric is the co-founder of Revision, which is a local nonprofit that he and Joseph founded to really tackle food insecurity in the Denver neighborhood of Westward. Westward is a food desert. And over the course of getting to know Eric and really learning more about his leading organization, we knew we wanted to profile Eric and his story. And doing the needs assessment with Eric, we sat down, and what we learned is that for Eric and Joseph, the journey began while they were studying abroad in Nicaragua. And so they had a chance to actually visit a sweatshop. And so they got to see the local labor conditions. They got to see how the local community was really being marginalized. And so much of the economic, sort of generation that was occurring around that sweatshop was not making it back to the individuals in that community. And so when it came time to tell their story at this event with our chancellor, our former chancellor, Chancellor Chop, we started with that. We said, take us back to the beginning. You're back in Nicaragua. What was that experience like being in the sweatshop, and what does that mean for you? And over the course of the event and the story that we told, we got closer and closer to what was the meat of the story. What does that mean for us as an organization? And what are the takeaways that we want our audience to do? So really thinking about sort of that idea of and this requires a lot of needs assessment and really going deep with the story. Really taking the time to really reverse engineer that in a way that begins to make sense for a lot of people. All right, so last up is taking all that data and then now starting to map out what does the journey look like for your attendees. Every great story has kind of a structure to it, and folks move through different phases. And a lot of times we tend to think of the work that we do as primarily sort of in that second category, the event, or maybe even the post-event. But I want you to pull it apart and think about how do we start to tell the event in sort of a multi-channel way. So before the event, that's building a sense of anticipation, that's using teaser trailers, social media, making sure that the email communication reflects, the story itself. In the event itself, really making sure that you're using all the different elements, the venue, the technology, everything to really sort of enhance and further go deeper with your story. And then post-event, how do we do? How do we land? And thinking about your surveys, thinking about your feedback mechanisms, really making sure that you're closing the loop around the story that you told and making sure that it resonated with the way, and then using that data to inform the next chapter. And that's where the in-between comes in, is using that as a time to help people remember, what was it like to experience that story, to witness that, to partake in that? And that's where you start to build tension for, if it's a series, chapter 2, or maybe you're going to pivot into a different story, a spinoff. So this is really a great activity that I think any team can do, and just take kind of these 4 areas, kind of draw them on a sheet of paper and create 4 columns. And so just kind of move through each phase. And what does our overarching story, what does the hero's journey look like in these specific areas of the event? And how do we help to make sure that all the elements of the event bring that to life? So another way to think about this is just run of show on steroids. I know many of us do this already when we think about the run of show, but think about how do you pull that apart to the whole experience. This gets into a lot of what we talk about in terms of experience design. Okay, so an example, I'm kind of running through the slides because really what I want to do is make sure that we preserve time at the end for your questions. So an example of kind of this attendee journey in our own experience is a recent event that we hosted as part of our Pioneering Denver series. And so this was all sort of in the event, but we really put a lot of attention and detail, and our team was just expert at really thinking through, the moment that people arrive, at the event, what are they greeted with in the parking lot? The last thing you want is someone showing up to your event feeling haphazard, feeling, I got lost in the parking. And those are things that we can't control, but if we can't fix it, we can feature it, and so this is an example of some signage, in the parking garage. That continued into our event experience when folks arrived. This is our amazing Megan Gorman greeting guests as they arrived. I think this was like their second day on the job. Really thinking through what does that sort of experience look like when folks begin to arrive? What does, how are we using the elements of our customer journey and our story to reinforce that in the entryway experience? Thinking through all the different elements of the event. For us, the story we were telling in this case was the achievement of one of our alumni chefs. We wanted to do that through really just showcasing the impact that he's had on a whole marketplace in Denver. He's inspired a whole generation of brewers and restaurateurs and chefs. And so every little element had that unique spin, that unique touch on it. So in the case of the bar, this was beer from one of our alumni-owned breweries. This is a custom cocktail from one of our alumni-owned bartenders. And we really thought through, what do we want the experience to look like when folks get there? We don't want to just have people arrive and sort of, try and mix and mingle, but what do we want the content of the conversation, and how do we begin to help people engage with our story before we've even said a word? Thinking about how do we position our leaders to be effective storytellers? How do we incorporate them into the story? How do they become really sort of experts at creating those different sort of landmarks, those temporal landmarks, to help you guide and understand the story, and also appreciate the context that the story exists in. Thinking through your run of show, thinking through the speakers and how you begin to put people into the mindset, but also the surroundings. I know this is an in-person example and this is difficult, but even in the virtual world, this is where really nailing the production quality, I think, begins to come in. I think a lot of us are accustomed to kind of sitting at your desk, but as we start to disrupt, Zoom webinars, and as we begin to think about how do we level that experience up, thinking about what does production quality look like at home, and how do we begin to use simple things like lighting, and materials to begin to elevate that, and then really just letting your heroes shine, putting them at the center of everything you do, equipping them, with the perspective and the inspiration to really kind of just have fun with their story, All right, so those are our 4 tips for creating events that resonate. Define your persona, activate your hero and really get them deep with their own story, reverse engineer that story in a way that really resonates for guests, and then really pull that apart and think about all the different moments throughout your event and ways that you can use to re-enhance or reinforce that story. And these are 4 principles of storytelling. So taking a stance, the era of neutral is over, and I think our communities, our constituents are really craving to see us use our platform power to communicate where we stand as a society, showcasing that inclusivity, making sure that we're reflecting the multiple voices that exist within our audience, demonstrating that authenticity, really taking that story. Joseph is a great example. That's a story that's very much in progress. It could very well flop, but we really wanted to bring people into what his authentic story was, and the way that he was kind of grappling with the success and what does that mean, and inspiring people in their own journeys as well too. And just making sure that the stories we tell are right-sized. Not every story is going to land with everyone, but once you've identified kind of what your segment is, what your target is, really just kind of thinking through how do you right-size that reference point so that they can be feeling inspired. Some ideas for how to put it to use. Thinking about those alumni stories, those donor stories. An individual that really overcame a challenge. Maybe it's a student that is the benefactor of a scholarship. If you're in donor relations, maybe it's it's an alum, a young alum that's really kind of struggling and grappling with that. But they've been able to achieve some real success. Or maybe it's a donor. Principal or transformational donor, and what was it like on their pathway, and what were the struggles that they overcame. Thinking about multi-day events, and maybe they become, chapters, within an overall story, and kind of pulling that apart. Using things like gala dinners, to help people go deeper with your story. You can use themes like, a night at the opera or a murder mystery, and then making sure that, again, all those elements of the event really sort of tie into that. And then the last thing really is just kind of synchronizing up that the whole ecosystem of the event to make sure that each element really capitalizes on the theme. So a couple of key takeaways here before we open up for your questions, and that's really that, storytelling can expand across all different event types. I hope that if there's anything that you walk away with today is that stories are sort of agnostic of channel. We can tell them through social, we can tell them through, in-person events, we can tell them through webinars, we can tell them through Instagram Live. There's so many different ways that we can tell stories, and the principles themselves and the tips that I've shared with you today, I hope are universal. So as you think about kind of your own marketplace, your own constituency, you can really, sort of incorporate that in a way that works for you. Stories are also hyper personal, and because of that, they create such deeper retention. They have the effect of just pulling people in, and making them want to engage more and to get excited about the story and to crave more of what that story means. They're also these authentic human experiences. They're not perfect. As an example of that, I think my garbage is being picked up outside, which you guys are probably picking up on that with the audio. So, authentic stories are real, and this isn't perfect. And sometimes you just got to learn to embrace that. And I feel like that really sort of invites people into the humanity of who you are. So last up is that stories really just tell the audience of who you are and what you believe. And I think that's something that we are all craving, it's also something that's really incumbent upon advancement in leadership, is to think about how do we convey who we are, what we stand for, the positions that we take. How do we make sure that that gets across so that we're not just watered down, and all the different appeals we get or all the different emails you receive that say, hey, we're taking a stance on Black Lives Matter, but how do you really tell the audience who you are and what you believe? So those are my takeaways. And with that, I ran through my slides. I know we have more time left than we need, but I want to open it up. Myra's going to kind of help us out here, facilitate some Q&A. And so this now becomes your time to answer any questions. If there's anything I missed, I want to welcome your feedback in. But Myra, if you want to kind of jump us off.
Sure. So we have a question here from Tamika that she really likes that you called out showing inclusivity. When telling student stories, how do you deal with marginalized students feeling exploited for their stories?
Oh, Tamika, that's a great question. I think you have to really sort of connect more deeply about what's the purpose behind telling that story, And this forces, I think, the organization and the leaders to really be authentic in terms of what their use of the story is, So not just championing the cause for the sake of the cause, but really thinking through what does it mean for that individual? What's the impact to them? For me, I tend to approach this from trying to strike that mutually beneficial place. And this is where our work gets really hard. I think oftentimes we think about advancement storytelling. We think about the purpose of it being to get people to positively reflect back on the university. I think that's only half of the story. The other half is, what does it mean to the individual whose story that we're sharing? I often tell people, you know, when we profile them, that I had this profound sense of gratitude for allowing them to, for allowing us to share their story. You know, so I think really embracing the responsibility that comes with telling that story, you know, and then really going beyond just sort of the level one, which is all about like, this person's amazing, which is why this university or the school is amazing, but really thinking about like, how do we actually use this as a way to support this individual? You know, for a lot of the stories we tell, that means, you know, sort of helping increase their customers or helping people get connected with their products, which is why we, you know, we spend a lot of time getting people deeply connected to their stories, but then the follow-up journey is all about, how do you support this person? You know, I think the call to action at the end usually is a very kind of selfish and internal, which is, you know, give to this fund or support the, you know, sort of this other event. But that to me is a great opportunity to really showcase the alum, to get people mobilized and out into the community, become patrons, become customers, become supporters of, you know, of those stories of those individuals. And that may look a little bit different, you know, for a student, you know, they're not obviously a business owner in the case of a lot of the stories that we tell, you know, but I think you got to spend the time to really sort of understand, you know, what is it about the story that matters to us? And then how, in telling that story, do we continue to drive support for that individual? So, great question.
This question is from Amanda. How would you suggest pivoting an event to a storytelling event, pitching that to leadership as a way that will in fact be engaging for the attendees when the history of the event is very traditional?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, you know, we've all been gifted, I think, in many ways. I know we don't want to think about the pandemic as a gift, but the opportunity, I should say, in this time is that we now get to challenge our sacred cows. You know, for a long time, that was an uphill battle, you know, and you have to get real radical. You had to have a great leader that was willing to support you. But, you know, I think leveraging some of the positionality of the world that we live in right now, you know, which is that we have to try different things. You know, we have to explore, we have to experiment. You know, we have to be willing to have the courage as event planners and event leaders to try different things. And the benefit is that now the audience wants different things. You know, usually that was the uphill battle, was that, you know, we had an idea of what we wanted to do, but we didn't want to shock the system. You know, we were worried that if we put it out there, nobody would come. You know, we're in, you know, this rare age and time where all those habits, all those patterns, all those behaviors now have been leveled down, you know? And so I would really be curious to see someone leverage, you know, this time as an opportunity to think about, okay, you know, maybe we can host an in-person event. So rather than just sticking a camera in front of someone, how do we tell the story? You know, how do we use the different media that's out there? How do we use YouTube? How do we use Zoom? How do we use Instagram Live? You know, how do we use these different channels in a way to effectively communicate that story? And so using this as an opportunity, really just with which to give yourself permission to try something else out. Great question.
Question from Lauren. How do you find the stories? I find that they use the same donor stories or student stories over and over, and it's hard to find new stories to tell.
Yeah, it's a great point. You know, it kind of depends on the model within your advancement institution. You know, for us, ours is very relational based. So in addition to thinking about the event strategy, you know, we're also out there kind of pounding the pavement and keeping our ears to the ground. If that's not a luxury, you know, that you have in your position, you know, a couple of thoughts. You know, you can do that, I think, through self-study. You can do that through things. You know, I talk about the idea of really paying attention to the macro trends. So making sure that you're on social, you know, making sure, you know, what are the stories that people are grappling with? How are they telling those stories? Instagram is such a great storytelling medium right now, you know, because it's so visual, it's so multi-channel, and it's also so popular. That's a great way just to sort of figure out what are the different stories, what are people gravitating towards, you know? You know, so I would definitely be curious to sort of look at that as a medium too. But then, you know, this is where some of the partnership piece that Corianne and Laurie talked about really comes in, and thinking about your partners. And, you know, so if you're not outbound yourself, you know, who are the folks on your team that do have sort of their ear to the ground, That can be development officers, that can be, different alumni engagement officers, that can be your leadership, that can be, it could be even as simple as the people that are doing your annual giving phone calls, and just sort of capturing their feedback and getting the data around what are people grappling with, what are they interested in, the other way to do that too is to think about your brand in the context of reframing. And so for many of us, I think we have our universities, our schools have a particular ethos to them. They're typically guided by a mission or value statements, and we kind of know what we stand for. But many of the opportunities we miss out on is how do we reinterpret that, or how do we reframe that for the modern era? In the case of DU, for us, pioneers is sort of our, is kind of our big moniker. It's not a mascot, and we'll go there. But we are the DU pioneers. And so how do we help people to better understand pioneering in the modern era? How do we reframe or sort of reuse that word in a way that invites the energy and the excitement about what it means to be a pioneer, what it means to be pioneering? So taking some of the ethos, some of the stuff that's out there, and thinking about, what are different ways in which people are bringing that story to life? So just some thoughts.
And I think this question from Devin kind of feeds off of the last one. What are the best ways to cultivate the stories you want to tell, and who do you collaborate with to showcase them?
Yeah, donor relations is obviously a great partner when it comes to storytelling. I think so much of the work that they're doing is trying to tell the story of, what does it mean to be, a significant donor to the university, but also what's the impact of that donation to our students and to our alums who have benefited from that. So really helping to better understand, I think, kind of where the rubber meets the road. Career services, our model is pretty unique at DU in that we've got career services integrated, but I know for many of you, career services is way off in a very distinct, different universe. But so much, I think, of the narrative around higher education and the accountability that we're all being sort of called into is what is our role in the success and the mobility of our students? So what are we doing to help them achieve lifelong success? It's sort of incumbent upon us as higher ed leaders to think about how we're accountable with the resources that were provided to achieve that success. And the Career Center actually ends up being a great place for locating those stories. So finding the individuals who maybe did an internship that was an unfunded internship, but maybe they benefited from some funding or some scholarship, or thinking about the different ways that students have been impacted by career services is always a great narrative, I think, for for different, if it's an event or if it's collateral. And then the last is admissions. I mean, admissions is in the storytelling business. They're really trying to convey through rich media and through sort of on-campus experiences, how do we tell the story of what does it mean to be part of this community, and so they naturally get this stuff, and they can become great folks to partner with if you're not already partnering with, and think about how do we evoke those stories, how do we tell the story of an individual who was transformed as a result of our community, and then starting to collect those, stories, starting to collect those relationships. It doesn't have to be a development officer, but thinking through how do you maintain contact with those folks and, over time, begin to locate and activate their own voices around coming in to share that story about your community.
This is a question from Anne. How would you approach telling a huge story for a campaign closing event series? It's overwhelming thinking about everything that could be shared considering the limited time allocated for the events themselves and in pre-post communications.
Yeah, it's a great question. My initial sense is, if it's a campaign and you're closing it, it should very much tie to what your campaign narratives are, what your campaign themes are. And, one of my colleagues, Meg Umlas from Boston University, just finished her campaign this past September. And, a great campaign is about, sort of having these bookend experiences, so thinking about how you launch that campaign, and then how do you, sort of tie a ribbon on it. The challenge we all face now is that we learn so much throughout the course of the campaign, and on top of that too, if you're wrapping up a campaign right now, chances are, there are certain restrictions, or, the way that you are wrapping up that campaign is maybe not the way that you had intended to when you first got started. So, to me, I would kind of go back to that idea of thinking through your closing as a series of chapters, and thinking through what ultimately is the narrative 5, 10, 15 years from now that you want people to walk away with around the impact of your campaign. And so use that to then kind of create your persona and your hero's journey, you know, is look at the transformation, look at whatever your sort of campaign values or campaign narratives are. And then use all the events that are part of the campaign closing as sort of an individual closing chapter. So thinking about, you know, what is the impact of the campaign on our students? What's the impact to our community? You know, what's the impact to the overall university? And what are different ways that we can position our community to really tell and broadcast that story of impact?
This is a question from Brian. Could you explain further how to reverse engineer your stories?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the basic premise, Brian, behind kind of reverse engineering is you have to kind of go deep with what the story is, you know? If you are in the space where you're doing kind of needs assessment work with potential speakers, sometimes this will come out, you know, in your work. And usually these kind of pre-meetings are great opportunities really just to sort of evoke, you know, from that individual, what is their story. And you kind of have to challenge them to go beyond the surface, you know. The senior leaders are the best at this. They know what their leadership narrative is. They can pull apart the individual experiences that really bring that to life. But, you know, kind of challenge them to go a bit deeper with that. You know, what did it mean growing up in that small town? You know, what did it mean when that professor, you know, supported you? What did it mean when, you know, that, you know, what are those experiences? And really sort of beginning, you know, this is sort of the evocative nature of storytelling. And our role, I think, is, you know, those who are designing the event is really to evoke from the individual, because oftentimes they won't know that. You know, but it's only through that conversation, it's only through that communication that they begin to really understand, you know, oh yeah, you know, that really was something that was transformational for me. Oh yeah, that really did have a big, you know, sort of impact on me. So once you've gone deep and you've got that data, you can start to see how the different pieces kind of fit into place. You know, I think my point with the slide and my point with the concept is that I think oftentimes we start with the end and we think the end is the story, and the end is great. I mean, it's nice because it's a personal sense of achievement for the individual, you know, but so much of the meaning that we derive is through the journey. Think about any great story that you've engaged with, and, you know, there's a reason why we don't go to the last page and want to know what happens. We love the tension, you know, we love the challenge, we love the uncertainty, you know, and so giving yourself permission, I think, to really sort of grapple with that and to sort of embrace the tension around that and just kind of going deep. And then once you've got all that data, thinking about then how do you tell that story? How do you kind of flip it on its head? You know, when it comes time to tell the event, don't just jump right into, okay, so you've made $1 billion and you just named a residence hall, you know, tell us what success looks like. Like, no, like talk to me about the time, you know, when you had to work 4 jobs, you know, when you were a sophomore at the university, and what did it mean to you when you received your first scholarship? You know, what was that moment like? You know, so that's kind of where the event storytelling piece comes in, and beginning to equip your moderators and all the different sort of characters within your story to be the conveyors of that story. Oh.
This question is from Kari. How much do you script your speakers versus letting them speak off the cuff? There can be worries about wildcard or off-message comments, but you do want to keep authentic voices.
Yeah, so, you know, in the example I kind of shared with you, let me kind of see if I can go back to it. So this is Frank and Jacqueline Bonanno. Anyone that knows Frank knows that he likes to drop some F-bombs, you know. So, you know, he's real hard on those that he works with, and one of his sort of claim to fame too is that he's launched about a dozen careers of different chefs around town. And everyone can tell their Frank story. And so, you know, for me, ultimately, this gets back to that authenticity piece. You know, that has to come through, you know. So when we sat down with Frank and Jacqueline, you know, we did our pre-event needs assessment with them. We went to their restaurant, and it was actually, it was a tough day for them. They'd actually ended up laying off 2 of their senior members. You know, they recently opened up a food market, a food hall here in Denver. And anyone that knows anything about food halls, those are just taken off. And so great concept, but, you know, in essence, the people that had got them to where they were and who they were as an organization at that point were not the people that were going to be taking them to the next level. And so they had just literally had a hard conversation, and they actually informed one of their original employees that they were letting him go. And so they were in tears when we arrived, you know. And so my job was just to like get out of the way, you know. In that meeting, I really just sort of, I tried to harness that energy, and the frustration that they were feeling at the time was we started this company because we cared so deeply about, food, and we wanted to bring that to life. And then our ethos as an organization was guided by our family values. We've got 2 young sons, and we wanted everyone on our team to feel like they were part of our family. And then now we have been so successful that we're experiencing the tension as it relates to that. It's becoming more difficult for us to maintain that value of family. So we literally took that and I said, stop, I don't want you to give away all the good content. And we came back to that in the event. We actually referenced that conversation and we said, hey, just the other day we were sitting down with you and, you were sort of lamenting the challenges of what it means to have a growing business, kind of talk to us more about, the emotion that's behind that. So, I don't script, our speakers. I typically when we do the needs assessment, I have gone deep, with their backgrounds. I've done all the web research, I've interviewed all the key players. And so I have a pretty good idea of kind of what the narrative is of their experience. And what I do is I say, hey, this is kind of how I'm framing it. These are the different chapters of the story. These are the different ways I want to kind of frame your experience. Are you okay with that? Does that make sense? Any objections, any corrections you feel like? And so these are the things I kind of want you to speak on. We have some that really, they kind of want the detailed list of questions, and then they, and so then I'll invite them to say, okay, here's this question, but really you're invited to kind of share this story that we talked about, and then I have others that's like, yeah, it's my life. I get it. I know it. I speak about it all the time. And I love, I can do it. So, kind of, you'll understand what the individual preference is, but I would caution against scripting the folks that you put up on stage. If you are interested in that authentic voice, you want it to come through in your event. You want it to humanize their story. And if it comes from a script, I think we feel that. We know that, and in our work, I think we know the difference now. We've been doing this long enough to feel that. So it kind of depends on the context or in the university. We have some events that are just scripted top to bottom, and it's just kind of the way it works, and it's the nature of that event, and it's the nature of the audience that we're really trying to engage, and also the nature of the leadership that we're engaging in that. But I think when it comes to storytelling, I think people, they know the script, so why not surprise and delight them, with some humility. So that's my 2 cents.
Andrea asks if you hire a production team to help create pieces for use.
We do with some of our larger scale events, so Alumni Weekend, when we're telling the story of the impact around our alumni honorees, that is an event that's highly produced. This was the first year I think that we were going to be bringing on a producer to kind of walk through that. In the past, our leadership has been the ones to kind of put that together, and I give them all tremendous credit. It's not a background that, it is a very specialized background, I should say, and so, I think once this kind of goes big, then yeah, it makes a lot of sense to pull in someone, from the production team. The other application though is, I've heard some of this in the chatter in the last couple of days, but I think there's value in bringing in a production team to think about your virtual events. A lot of event professionals I think are pivoting into thinking about things like lighting and things like, setup. And so I think as we start to think about how do you level up your virtual events to be more than just sort of a, what we do every day, like a virtual meeting, if you will, I think bringing in folks that can really give you a perspective on, production design and quality and lighting and background and staging, and theater professionals are all great at this. If you've got those folks in your team, definitely pulling them in to kind of think through. People in marketing are also great too. They really pay attention to this stuff too. So that's where it may make sense to bring in on a one-time basis an organization or a group that sort of says, hey, if you want to level up your production value, here's some of the equipment, or here's some of the stuff, here are the strategies you should be mindful of.
So kind of following up on that question, there's a question for Mary Beth. Are you able to produce content in-house? She asked if you work with production companies and other vendors. And then her final question is tips on containing budget.
Yeah, boy, isn't that the the topic of the day? To me, again, it's all about scale. If you're looking at things like alumni awards, if you're looking at galas, chances are you're bringing in a production team anyway, and so, I think for these smaller scale events, my hope is that you can take some of the content and some of the takeaways here and begin to just, sort of reimagine how you might do that throughout your events, and then giving yourself permission to try this out over the course of the next year. If it's a large event, there's obviously a lot of pressure on us right now to be very accountable with our resources. And in many cases, those resources are being sliced. So, I do think the principles themselves are pretty universal. You can apply this to, an online webinar. You can also apply it to how you think about a large conference, worst case scenario, take this as sort of your guide, and use it to help inform how do we set up the event in a way that begins to convey the story. How do we think about the various players? How do we think about the plot arc? How do we think about the hero? How do we position them to really be the storytellers? And then spend time there first, and then dive into details and logistics and, okay, well, this is where the podium goes and this is who's doing the introduction, and, but you really have to spend that time up front, I think, doing the homework to get a feel for what is the ultimate story that we want to tell here, and then what are the different channels and different ways we can tell that story.
And this is a question from Corian. How do you align storytelling in various events, alumni, for example, and how that also tells your institution's story?
Yeah, it's a great question, Corian. I think about some of the work that you've done at Evergreen and, kind of championing your student stories and finding different ways to bring that in too. So, to me, I think a great, it kind of depends on what the ultimate story is. So if you're doing an event, with which you want to create a sense of pride, think about what the pride means. What is pride in action? We talk a lot about empathy, and empathy is this great word. It's this great idea. But what does empathy look like when it actually manifests? And it's curiosity. It's having a sense of openness about the world and being attuned to the feelings and the emotions. And so, do the same work around sort of like what is, if it's homecoming and you want pride, what does pride look like? This is some of the work around the persona. Pride looks like, people who went to Evergreen and had a great experience, and they want to come back and share that love. Pride looks like the amazing entrepreneurs, that we put out into the world, the ice cream shop owners, the business owners, the people in enterprise, so it means positioning them in the marketing collateral, and really showcasing what it means for their success. This is where an overarching kind of brand, I think can really play in very nicely, and if you've got kind of a campaign narrative, I'm not talking about, a campaign, a fundraising campaign, but talking about sort of a, if you've got a series of events or larger events around, like, what is the larger narrative around that event? And think about it in terms of like a political campaign. Ultimately, what do we want to convey, and who are the key players we want to bring in to help reinforce, that the narrative of the campaign. And so, I don't know if I answered your question, but that's kind of how I would start going after that, is thinking about all the different parts and pulling apart and then making sure that each one sort of ties into that broader campaign.
We have about 2 minutes left. I don't know if you want to take a last question or if you want to do final closing remarks, and then I also have a closing.
Do we have any more questions that are waiting?
About 3 left.
Okay. You want to pick one at random?
Sure. This is from Michelle. Do you have any resources of how to develop better questions in interviewing or getting to the heart of storytelling? Yeah.
To me, ultimately, spend time interacting and engaging with great storytellers. This is where I kind of, your own self-study is where you can have fun with it. So, if you're the kind of person that loves, fiction, if you love a great podcast, if you love a great audiobook, audiobooks really are just a great format out there, but just become kind of a student of the game, and as you're enjoying all this material, just think through, like, how do people ask great questions? Podcasts to me are just the perfect place to go to, and whether it's The Daily or there's so many ones out there, This American Life, they're all great storytelling mechanisms, and become a student of how people are asking questions. Terry Gross is another one of my favorites. There's actually great articles nowadays out there about, the art of questioning and storytelling. And so I think just, becoming kind of a student of what it means to ask a great story, what is a compelling, or what it means to ask a great question, and what's a compelling way you can do that. And whether that's, you know, an interview on the news, or that's a podcast. There's so many different ways that you can kind of get that material. So, you know, just give yourself permission to capture great questions and great stories as you hear them, and then use that to inform some of the work.
Well, we're at time. So I want to thank Brian for this wonderful presentation, and thanks to all of you for participating. As a reminder, the session was recorded and both the recording and session slides will be shared post-conference. We are now going to take a 15-minute break before the closing panel. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. See you in a few.